uh, uh,
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the session on the history of the International Marxist Tendency. The International Marxist Tendency traces its roots all the way through the First, Second, Third, and Fourth Internationals. In the post-war period, there was a general retreat by the forces of genuine Marxism, and the left was dominated by the distortions of Stalinism and reformism. While other groups were preparing for a third world war or denying the existence of the working class, our tendency put up a firm defense of the theories and traditions of Marxism. Which at every turn were proved to be correct. By building on the firm basis of theory, our organization is today emerging as the strongest revolutionary force amongst workers and youth worldwide. So let me introduce you Fred Weston. He is a leading activist of the IMT. And he will introduce this discussion. Just 2 points, I have 2 books to advertise. The first one is from Ted Grant, History of British Trotskyism. And the second one is from Alan Woods on Ted Grant, The Permanent Revolutionary. So Fred is doing the lead-off for 90 minutes. Until the break at 5:35 p.m. British Summer Time. And then at 7:30 p.m. BST, we will have a discussion. At 8:30 until 9, we will have the sum up from Fred Weston. So wait a minute, Fred. I'll activate your microphone.
Okay, I can go, yeah, Hubert?
Let's go, Fred.
Okay, well, I was asked to provide comrades with my notes for the lead-off to help the translators. But I'm too old for that. I have these kind of notes, as you can see, fully digitalized, and furthermore, far too much for 90 minutes. So I think I might do what Ted Grant used to do, which was to read the first page of his notes and then not look at them for the rest of the talk. But we'll see, we'll see. Now, Ted Grant has a major role, obviously, in this history. Because the history of the IMT is firmly connected with the ideas and methods that Ted kept alive. Of course, we are Trotskyists and we go back to the left opposition of the 1930s. Those communist fighters who fought against the bureaucratic degeneration of the Soviet Union. And we build on their tradition. It was a difficult period in which to defend the genuine ideas of Marxism. And it's an unfortunate fact that many elements on the left who claim the mantle of Trotsky, the mantle of Lenin, in reality have a sectarian approach. And they do a disservice to the movement. And you see, I remember with Ted, it was what distinguished him, I think, was the ability to dialogue with ordinary working class people. While at the same time not losing the revolutionary perspective. It's an ability to work in the wider labor movement with a language that workers can understand. At the same time, without losing the revolutionary program, analysis, and perspective. One of the dangers facing the revolutionary movement is adaptation to the reformist milieu. You see, in periods of relative stability, in periods of economic upswing, most of the workers want to get on with their lives. And they're not ready to listen to the revolutionaries. What will push the masses to revolutionary ideas are not the Marxists. But it's the crisis of the capitalist system as it unfolds. So revolutionaries can work for long periods, seemingly against the stream. And there can be temptation to adapt to a given level of consciousness at a given moment. And this can push the revolutionaries towards reformist adaptation. At the same time, it can also lead to the development of a sectarian approach. Because this comes from frustration and impatience with the working class. And very often we see both the opportunist tendencies and the ultra-left tendencies in the same people or in the same organizations. Now, what distinguished, I think, Ted was this ability to maintain a balanced position. And this, I think, is what characterized the organizations that Ted helped to build. First of all, the Workers' International League in 1938. The RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party, later on during the Second World War. The Militant, before it degenerated. And subsequently, the IMT. Now this, what I referred to earlier on, this adaptation to opportunism and this tendency towards sectarianism are things that the Marxists are in a constant battle against. It was present in 1938. In 1945. In the 60s, in the 70s. As the militant towards the end degenerated, its leadership went into an ultra-left direction. But there were also elements that went in an opportunist direction and buried themselves in the Labour Party and the trade unions in a bureaucratic manner. And we ourselves have had to constantly be alert to these tendencies. And on occasion, we've had to separate from individuals or groups who had gone too far in either ultra-leftism or opportunism. Now, sometimes I get asked the question, what guarantees do we have that all this won't happen again? I'll say it again. And it's not my invention. I'm only quoting somebody else. If you want a guarantee, buy a washing machine because they come with a guarantee. But even they have a guarantee which has a limit. Now, the only thing that comes anywhere close to a guarantee is political education, attention to theory, and the building of Marxist cadres, i.e., active members of the organization who have a good grounding in Marxist theory and who can think for themselves. Another thing which we mustn't forget, and Ted always used to insist on this, is that revolutionaries must have a sense of proportion. And we must maintain that. We mustn't get carried away. Once you think you're much stronger and much more powerful and much more important than you really are, you're on the road to ruin. Another thing which revolutionaries need is a sense of humor. Which is connected to a sense of proportion. I think I have a sense of humor, so at least I have one of the elements. Now, to move on, why are we discussing the history of the IMT? Well, it's because capitalism is a global system. The working class struggle is a global struggle. And socialism can only succeed as a global system. The Russian Revolution, the marvelous revolutionary events of October 1917, unfortunately, was not followed by revolutions, or successful revolutions in other countries. And therefore, it degenerated into the monstrous Stalinist regime that we saw. And that was because of its isolation to one country, and a very backward one at that. Now, Stalinists always talk of socialism in one country. They talk about national roads to socialism. I remember in the 70s in Britain, the British road to socialism. Or in Italy, it was the Italian road to socialism. The question has to be asked, therefore, why did Lenin give so much importance to the building of the Communist International.
15 minutes gone.
Why bother if it's possible to build socialism in one country? The reason Lenin gave such importance is because Lenin understood that either the revolution spread to other countries or it faced the risk of being overthrown or degenerating. Capitalism is an international system, and never like today has it become evident that the problems facing humanity can only be solved on a global scale. The pandemic, climate change, they do not recognize national borders. Neither does the economic crisis. We have immense productive forces that have been created. We have the development of science and technique to unprecedented levels. Recently, very recently, both India and the United Arab Emirates sent probes on their way to Mars. And yet, millions, billions of people face poverty and hunger. For that, we need, what we need is to remove the system. The working class is the class that will do that. But the whole of history shows the working class also needs leadership up to the task. In each country, we must build initially the nucleus of a Marxist organization and then work to transform that later on the basis of events into a major force. That is what the IMT stands for. Now the question is, where do we come from? What is our history? The time I have, I can't go into the details of every event, every moment. But I will attempt to touch on the main points. Hubert mentioned two books. Those books I recommend to everybody. They should read them if they haven't read them, if they want a more detailed account of what I'm going to talk about. And as Hubert said, we stand on the tradition of the first, second, third International, the first four Congress of the Communist International, the left opposition of Trotsky.
20 minutes gone.
and the founding Congress of the Fourth International in 1938. Now, Ted Grant plays an important role in this. In 1928, he joined the Trotskyist movement. When he was a 15-year-old boy. He bought the paper of the American Trotskyists in a bookshop in South Africa. That's how he began to get involved. He subsequently moved to Britain in 1934. With a few other comrades from South Africa. And I'm fast forwarding, I can't go into the details. In 1938, together with Ralph Lee, he and a small group of comrades set up what became known as the Workers' International League. I want to give a bit of a taste of the environment that Ted found when he came to Britain. There were small Trotskyist groups in Britain in the 1930s. And it would be honest to say that they suffered from the disease of sectarianism. For instance, Trotsky's advice initially was that they should set up a tendency within the Independent Labour Party. They divided over that. Some agreed, some didn't. When it was clear that the fruitful period of work in the ILP was coming to an end, and Trotsky advised them to move their forces to the Labour Party, again, there were divisions within the small group of Trotskyists. Because as usual, you have sectarians who first they refuse to go in. When they do go in, they adapt in an opportunist manner and don't accept the advice of Trotsky. And again, some of them did accept Trotsky's advice and went into the Labour Party. But from my reading of that period, it's not enough to judge whether a group is working correctly simply by seeing whether they are in or outside the Labour Party. Because you can adapt in an opportunist manner when you're working in the reformist milieu. So what we had when Ted arrived was different. By 1938, you had several small Trotskyist groups with different positions. Some were outside the Labour Party. Some were inside. I would say they all suffered from the small circle mentality, which we've had a separate discussion on here at this school. Ted's group started off as basically an expulsion, actually, from one of these groups in Paddington in London, and they decided to launch the Workers' International League as a consequence. Which was orientated, it was working in the Labour Party. But there was another group also working in the Labour Party, Trotskyist group. But I would argue there was a difference between the two groups. Ted's group was openly defending the ideas of Marxism. No hint of opportunism in the way they presented their ideas. But it wasn't just that, it was also an outgoing group. They were selling papers in London on, the metro stations. They were going to the factories and selling papers. They were genuinely going out into the working class to build, and they were building, whereas the others were stagnating. Now, what happened in 1938 is the following. Preparations were being made to organize the founding Congress of the Fourth International. James Cannon, a leader of the American section of the Fourth International, came to Britain. His aim was to fuse all the Trotskyist groups into one organization and then go to the Congress in France, which was to found the Fourth International with a successful fusion behind his, in his pocket. Little problem. There was no principled unity on how to work amongst these groups. The policy of the Fourth International for Britain was actually being carried out by the will. They were carrying out the advice of Trotsky. Curiously enough, the will did not become the official section of the Fourth International in 1938.
30 minutes gone.
Why is that? Well, when Cannon met with the will, and curiously, the only group that Cannon not only spoke to the leaders, but spoke to the whole membership in a meeting was the will. The Will comrades accepted that they would participate in the conference, which was aimed at fusing the groups together. But they explained the conditions for a fusion do not exist. And if you look at the final result of the Fusion Congress, you see why. They formed an organization which had some of its members doing independent work, some of them doing Labour Party work. They had not agreed on how to work. They simply formally accepted to declare themselves members of the same organization. Ted's group around Ralph Lee of the Will refused to participate in what they saw as a farce. Cannon never forgave the Will comrades for that. How could they not carry out the dictates of Cannon? That shows you the method of Cannon. Instead of basing himself on the politics, on a common policy, it was just force the groups together. You cannot do that. It will not work. He went so far that he even hid from the delegates present at the founding Congress of the Fourth International that the Will had applied first to be recognized as the official section because they were carrying out the policy of the International. He hid that from the delegates. They said, failing that, if the conference did not recognize that, they requested to be recognized as a sympathizing group of the Fourth. As you can see in the figure of Cannon, there was a disease present right from the very early days of the formation of the Fourth International, unfortunately. There is in the writings of Leon Trotsky, the volume 1938-39, a text, which is basically it's an interview, a dialogue between C.L.R. James and Trotsky. And it's interesting what C.L.R. James tells Trotsky. He's describing to Trotsky the various groups that exist in Britain. And this is what he says. There is also another group, Lee's group in the Labour Party. Lee was then the leading figure in the will. And he says, which refused to have anything to do with fusion. Which is a lie, by the way. Because they said they were prepared to go through the process of discussion. But then he quotes correctly saying, he said, saying that they quoting Lee, the Lee group, saying that they said it was bound to fail. Little detail, the next sentence. The Lee group is very active. Now it's interesting, in the same dialogue with C.L.R. James, what's Trotsky have to say about the Trotskyists in Britain? This is Trotsky's judgment of those that entered the ILP. He says, not all our comrades entered the ILP. And those that did, and they developed an opportunistic policy so far as I could observe. And that is why their experience in the ILP was not so good. But then if you go to a note to this text in the writings of Trotsky, and of course the note is produced by Pathfinder, which was controlled by the American SWP under Cannon. This is their explanation. The Lee Group came into existence in 1938 as a result of purely personal grievances. And had no discernible political program. That's the way they present that event. The truth is, the will was actually the healthiest of all these groups. So far did the publishers of Pathfinder Press go in this question that they hid one letter from Trotsky to Ted's group. I won't go into the details because there is a long explanation by Alan Woods on this question. But it was a letter that Trotsky wrote after the will had published Trotsky's Lessons of Spain. In another interview, Trotsky praises, and it can only be the will that he's referring to, he praises them for having acquired a small printing press, because they were the only group that did that.
40 minutes gone.
Read Alan's text to find the details of how we discovered this letter and how we finally got it recently, which was a very important development for us, because it showed that what Ted had said all those years was true. The letter did exist and it was finally produced. Now, within a few weeks, the new group that they'd formed split apart, as the will had predicted. And then, precisely because the will was the healthiest of these groups, if we look at what happened during the Second World War, the will begins to grow significantly. I have lots of detailed information here, which I can't quote because of time. The significant workers that they won over, trade union leaders, shop stewards, factory leaders, they won them to the will. In 1941, they changed their orientation. The Labour Party was empty at that stage. It was in a national coalition. The war was on. The comrades of the will actively intervened in all the major strikes. And you have to understand, the Labour Party was in a coalition with the Conservatives and the Liberals. The official Communist Party, the Stalinist Communist Party, their position was to support the war effort, and they were against strike action. And the situation was one where the will was making very important gains, especially on the industrial front amongst the workers. The Stalinists, because of this growing influence of the RCP, because the RCP was then formed in 1940. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. I'll explain that. By 1944, the will was by far the strongest of all the Trotskyist groups. And the Fourth International had to recognize that. And that's how there was a fusion with the best of the others, you could say. And that was the basis for the creation of the new organization, basically under the leadership of the will, which became known as the Revolutionary Communist Party. Now, there is an interesting little document that you can actually find on the Marxist Internet Archive. It's called Clear Out Hitler's Agents. It was a pamphlet, a leaflet produced by the official Communist Party, attacking the RCP and the will as agents of Hitler because they supported strikes. The reply of the will in 1942 to this slander which you can also find on the Marxist Internet Archive. It's called Factory Workers, Be on Your Guard, Clear Out the Boss's Agents. And as I said, Ted Grant always had a sense of humor. They published a leaflet. They published a leaflet in which they offered a £10 reward to any worker who could find one page in this Stalinist pamphlet which had less than 3 lies in it. The workers had a good laugh, but nobody claimed the £10. Now, towards the end of the war, the comrades were involved in the apprentices' strikes in the northeast of England. They had a strong base. They even had soldiers in the 8th Army spreading the ideas of Trotskyism to the soldiers, to the British soldiers. As part of the RCP involvement in the strikes, several of leading figures of the RCP were arrested, kept in prison, and put on trial. But in the army, in Egypt, the British army, you had what was called the Cairo Soldiers' Parliament. It was a kind of, I suppose, an organization of debate amongst the soldiers where they discussed, and they even published bulletins among the soldiers.
50 minutes gone.
And among the soldiers, the slogan was raised, we are fighting, that is the war, as they saw it, an anti-fascist war as they saw it, we're fighting for the right to strike. That had an effect, and in the end, they had to let them out on bail, and eventually they had to drop the case. Now, The perspectives of the Fourth International and the perspectives of Trotsky before he died were that the Second World War would end with a wave of revolution like the First World War. In a certain sense, that was true. The Greek Civil War, the partisan movement in Italy, the partisans in France, the colonial revolution was given a massive impetus. India, China. But it's true to say that things did not work out as they had predicted, particularly in the advanced capitalist countries. The strengthening of the Soviet Union under Stalin the spread of deformed worker states from the Soviet Union to Eastern Europe enormously strengthened the authority of Stalinism in that particular period. And the defeat of the movement in several countries created the conditions for economic revival in the capitalist countries, in the advanced capitalist countries. The perspectives that the Trotskyists had worked out had to be reappraised. And in spite of the successful work done during the war, the changed conditions immediately after the war had an impact on the RCP. The leadership of the RCP around TED attempted to reappraise, to draw a balance sheet of the situation. TED in 1946, in a document called Economic Perspectives, which was a proposed line of amendment to the International Conference of the Fourth International. He criticized those who were talking about the spontaneous collapse of capitalism. He said this, to quote, he said, with the weakness of the parties of the Fourth International, which remain small sects at this stage, the capitalists have been enabled to find a way out of the collapse and decline of the economy. This has prepared the way in Western Europe for a steady and fairly rapid recovery. And he added, the Fourth International will only discredit itself if it refuses to recognize the inevitable recovery. And it will disorientate its own cadres, as well as the broad masses, by predicting a permanent slump and slow rhythm of recovery in Western Europe. When events are taking a different shape. Of course, Ted had a balanced position. After explaining that a recovery was taking place, he explained, however, a new recovery, this is what he says, a new recovery can only prepare the way for an even greater slump and even an economic crisis than in the past. Compare what the leaders of the RCP were saying with what the leaders of the Fourth International were saying. And you tell me who had the more balanced position and whose ideas have been confirmed by history. Now, Ted did not have a crystal ball. He couldn't see how long and how big the boom was going to be. But he had eyes to see. And he could see what was in front of his eyes. That there was an economic recovery taking place in that particular moment. And it was necessary to reorientate the forces of the Fourth International. But the leaders of the Fourth International refused to listen, not just on the question of economic perspectives. Their perspective was that the Soviet Union was about to collapse. Read what Ted and the leaders of the RCP were saying. They were explaining that the opposite was the case. Read what they were saying about China. Ted, even before Mao came to power, because there was speculation among some Trotskyists that Mao would not come to power, he would betray. I can't go into the details here. You read the texts. You read, for instance, a reply to David James, which is available on the Marxist Internet Archive. Ted explained that Mao would come to power with an independent base. And therefore, and what would come to power would be a bureaucratic caste similar to the Soviet Union. Now, let's be clear. We welcomed the Chinese Revolution as the second most important event in history after the Russian Revolution itself. But that it would have a bureaucratic deformation from the day one.
60 minutes.
And on this basis, Ted predicted that the Chinese bureaucracy would come into conflict with the Soviet bureaucracy. History proved Ted to be correct within about 10 or 15 years. But what is most incredible about the leaders, the so-called leaders of the Fourth International at the time, was their refusal to recognize that the Second World War had even ended. I will read canon from November 1945. This is what Cannon said. Trotsky predicted that the fate of the Soviet Union would be decided in the war. That remains our firm conviction. Only, and listen to this, only make sure your ears are nice and clean and you can hear this, because you might not believe it. This is canon. Only we disagree with some people who carelessly think the war is over. The war has only passed through one stage and is now in the process of regroupment and reorganization for the second. The war is not over. And the revolution which we said would issue from the war in Europe is not taken off the agenda. I will stop the quote there because I think it's enough. Can you imagine going to the working class at the end of the Second World War? And you tell them, the war is not over. There is no economic recovery. And revolution is around the corner, basically. They had completely lost their bearings. When it became obvious that the war was over, then they began to predict the Third World War. I will quote Pierre Frank from December 1951, Second World War. This was at the third Congress of the Fourth International. It says, the Third World Congress of the Trotskyists has clearly drawn the positions of our movement in the coming war. This is Pierre Frank. This is all available if you look it up. With this total lack of understanding of the real world they were in, they destroyed the Fourth International. In Britain, they maneuvered. They found people to support their position. An individual called Jerry Healy, who was ready to support them. We then spent the next several decades predicting the Third World War. And they expelled Ted Grant in a situation where the RCP was basically in a state of collapse. Can you imagine? The objective conditions were difficult, and then all these maneuvers from the top had a demoralizing effect on the ranks of the RCP. In spite of all this, in 1950, Ted wrote an open letter to what had then become the official section of the Fourth International. Ted was now outside of that organization. And he's appealing them to reappraise. This is what he said, analyzing the situation. He says, this poses new theoretical problems to be worked out by the Marxist movement. Under conditions of isolation and paucity of forces, that's of small forces, new historical factors could not but result in a theoretical crisis of the movement. Posing the problem of its very existence and survival. Now, how many times have we quoted Lenin, who said that there's no such thing as the final crisis of capitalism? I have here the bulletin on the Third World Congress of the Fourth International of 1951.
70 minutes.
Obviously, it's a mirror image, as you can see. But what it says is the final crisis of world capitalism. Now, all the subsequent groups that emerged from the splits and sub-splits and splinters and fragmentations of the Trotskyist movement all have, unfortunately, a certain amount of this DNA. Remember, 1938, TED was kept out of the fourth by Cannon. In 1950, they expelled TED and his group. In the 50s, I can't go into the details here, because of the splits in the Fourth International, the Fourth ended up with no section in Britain. The people that maneuvered against TED then came into conflict with the Fourth International. And in the mid-50s, the question was posed as whether TED's group should go back into the Fourth International. They debated that question. I remember speaking to some of the older comrades who told me that some of them were not too keen. But it was a very small group. I don't know, 30 to 50 for membership in the 1950s. Isolated in Britain, in very difficult conditions. They decided we'll go back in. They didn't agree with the policy and the perspectives of these people. But they were hoping that to break out of their isolation, they were hoping there would be some healthy elements somewhere in the Fourth. What's interesting here is this. In 1945-48, TED was fighting the ultra-left perspectives of the leaders of the Fourth International. But by the time we get to the end of the 50s, he's fighting their opportunism. They had become, because the Third World War hadn't taken place, the economy hadn't collapsed, the Soviet Union had not collapsed, reality banged them so hard on the head that they swung 180 degrees the other way. And they started to see deficit financing and all kinds of ideas that explained that capitalism was facing a long-term boom and crisis were off the agenda. They even played with the ideas of bourgeoisification of the working class, some of them. One of the reasons why TED wrote, "Will There Be a Slump?" in 1960 was in polemic against the international leadership. And against the reformists, of course, who thought that capitalism has now solved all its problems. In 1958-60, more or less, there was an opposition group developed in TED's group. They had this idea that we shouldn't have an independent paper. That they should form a paper with other lefts. They were adapting opportunistically. What's interesting is where these people ended up. They ended up as becoming the future Mandelites. Utterly opportunist. Within 10 years, they were utterly sectarian and ultra-left. As you can see, Ted, throughout the whole of his history, was fighting both opportunism and ultra-leftism in the movement. And remember, there were other Trotskyist groups working in the Labour Party at that time. But the question is it's not whether you're in or out, it's how you work. In the early 60s, Ted's group was coming to the conclusion that we need a clear banner That's what led to the launching of the militant paper in 1964. But they also had to come to terms with the so-called Fourth International. In this pamphlet, we have a document which was presented to the Congress of the so-called Fourth International, 1965. The International refused to circulate the document. Ted Grant said the Second International had become a post office. He said, you guys are not good even at being postal delivery workers. They basically expelled Ted for the third time. This is an example of the early militant. This is from June 1968. In 1970, Ted wrote a document called Program of the International.
80 minutes.
Which I advise all comrades who haven't read it to read it. It's available online. Because it draws a balance sheet of all these years I've been talking about. And it refers to the future international. In fact, there's a subtitle, How Will the International Be Organized? Remember, this was a small group isolated in one country. But they had something the others didn't have. Ideas and the Marxist method. and a balanced approach. They worked, but by 1970, the militant as a tendency gained a majority in the youth of the Labour Party. And then began to break out of the national isolation. Making contacts with the left young socialists in Sweden, in Ireland, in Belgium, in Germany. I remember in 1974, which was a key moment for capitalism as well, the first real, you could say, world recession since the Second World War. I remember the events of the 1970s, starting with May 68. The hot autumn in Italy, 1969. The anti-war movement internationally against the Vietnam War. The events in South America with revolution and counter-revolution in countries like Chile and Argentina. The growing revolutionary movement of the Spanish workers after decades of Franco dictatorship. The collapse of the junta in Greece. The Portuguese Revolution. The defeat of Portuguese imperialism in Angola and Mozambique. There was a worldwide movement of the workers and the youth. And those are the conditions in which finally we established a new international. Which gave itself the name then of the Committee for a Workers' International. I remember at the time we were gathering our forces. We gave key importance to the events of Spain. We concentrated all our energy on finding contact with the youth and the workers in the underground in Spain. That's when we decided to send Alan Woods to Spain under the Franco dictatorship. And starting with a small nucleus, we built up quite a powerful tendency very quickly in a very short amount of time. We made contact with left groups in Greece just after the collapse of the junta, and we won over a group in Greece. I can't go into the details, but the international was growing. We began the work in Italy. We began the work in North America, in South America. We won a group of South Africans. This is the first issue of their paper. And this is one of their perspectives documents, for which they were expelled from the ANC. We were growing, becoming a strong force. Particularly in Britain, where we were becoming a household name. Now, I know that Rob is going to go into more details on this part of our history.
3 minutes left.
So I'm not going to go into too many details. But we started getting councillors, MPs. Our MPs were different from all the others. They took the wage of a worker. And they gave the rest back to different causes of the labor movement. So popular were our MPs. I have a personal little anecdote. I grew up in Coventry in the Midlands in England. My mother was working in a restaurant which was going to close, and then we're going to sack the workers. My mother, not particularly political. But she said once, if that MP, Nellist, if he was the manager, he wouldn't treat us like this, would he? My cousin's husband, another, not very political, he said, talking about Dave Nellist, he says, he's the working man's MP. We had a strong base in Liverpool. We intervened massively in the miners' strike. And we led the poll tax movement of millions of people. Now, unfortunately, that organization degenerated. And I won't go into the details, Rob can explain more, but in 1991, we began to separate our ways. The myth is that we separated over the Labour Party. That's only very, very partially true. The reality was the whole setup, the whole regime within the militant had degenerated. We were forced to break with this. And we launched in 1992 what is now known as the International Marxist Tendency. And it wasn't easy. And it wasn't a clear run. We went through a lot of clarification. And we had to separate further with elements which I believe some had gone in an ultra-left direction, others had adapted to the reformist milieu. The IMT is not prepared to make concessions on questions of principle. Marxist theory is the key. We regrouped and we began to rebuild. And in the last 20 or so years, from nothing, we have built strong organizations in Canada and the United States. We encountered the comrades in Brazil, the leaders of the Occupy Factories movement. At the height of the Venezuelan revolution. And discovered we had a lot in common. And we united. And we built in several other countries. In Nigeria and South Africa, Indonesia, Pakistan, most recently in Russia. We have built what we believe is the nucleus of a future powerful Marxist international. Based on the traditions of the first, second, third, and fourth international, on the ideas developed by Ted Grant, on the ideas that we further developed since then. Now, a lot more, I don't want to encroach on the other talk you're going to get tomorrow, which is on building the organization. I will leave that to another comrade. But I've tried to outline the basic points of our history. And as you see, it's not an organizational question. At every turn, it's been a political question. Understanding the processes. Understanding the post-war period. Understanding the perspectives for the Stalinist countries. Understanding the colonial revolution. And maintaining a firm and clear perspective that it's the working class which will change society. I'll have to leave it there because I've gone over my time. I might come back to a few points maybe in the summing up. But I will leave it there for now, comrades.
Thank you very much, Fred. Just before the break, I have a very important announcement. On the 14th of July, Comrade Hamid from the Pakistani section of the IMT was abducted from his home by the Rangers, a paramilitary group in Pakistan. In many cases, victims of the Rangers have been tortured and many have lost their lives. We appeal to all those watching to hold protests against these crimes of the Pakistani state. You can write letters and emails to Pakistani embassies in different countries in a personal capacity or on behalf of your organization. A video and an article have been published on the Marxist.com website, and this can be posted on social media with the hashtags #Release Amin, #Stop State Abduction in Pakistan. Thank you in advance, everybody. We reconvene in at 7:30 p.m. British Summer Time in 17 minutes. Okay, so we begin now the discussion with Comrade Paolo Grassi. It's up to you.
We start now with the contribution from Comrade Paolo from Italy.
Buonasera compagni, voglio iniziare questo intervento.
Good evening, comrades. I will start this contribution
Rispetto a una considerazione, che la
one-
storia della nostra internazionale è la storia della difesa di un programma e delle idee del marxismo contro tutto e tutti.
with the idea that the history of our international is the history of a defense of our program and of our ideas against everyone and everything.
Contro il settarismo, contro l'opportunismo, ma anche contro la potenza di fuoco di riformisti e stalinisti.
Against sectarianism, against reformism, and also against the big power of the Stalinists.
I principi citati da Fred sono fondamentali.
And the principles that Fred quoted are of fundamental importance.
Fred ha detto che non esistono garanzie contro la degenerazione.
Fred explained that there are no guarantees against the degeneration,
Ma che quello che può aiutare sono la formazione politica, la formazione teorica e la costruzione dei quadri.
but that only political, theoretical education and cadre building can help.
Io volevo fare alcuni esempi di come questo sia stato fondamentale per la sezione italiana.
And I would like to give a few examples of how these were fundamental importance in the history of our Italian section.
Tutti i compagni presenti in questa scuola hanno dovuto affrontare momenti difficili e nuotare controcorrente.
All the comrades present in this school had to face difficult times and go against the stream.
Per la sezione italiana questa è stata una costante per decenni.
And this was a permanent trait for our section for several decades.
Ma i quadri si possono costruire anche controcorrente.
But we can build cadres also when swimming against the stream.
All'inizio degli anni '80, quando il nostro giornale si chiamava Falce e Martello,
At the beginning of the 80s, when we had a paper named Falce Martello, the Hammer and Sickle,
e nasce come giornale della gioventù comunista in un circolo del Partito Comunista in una città di provincia,
which was founded as a paper published by a branch of the communist youth in a small provincial town in Italy.
un pugno di giovani compagni vengono espulsi rapidamente dal Partito Comunista.
A handful of young comrades are very quickly expelled by the Communist Party for that.
Una cosa oggi difficile da capire per la sproporzione dei rapporti di forza che c'era tra un apparato mastodontico e un gruppo giovane di compagni.
Maybe it's difficult to understand it now because to understand that enormous disproportion between the force of this gigantic apparatus and this small nuclei of comrades.
Ma le burocrazie riformiste e staliniste si parlavano a livello internazionale e tutti sapevano quello che era il militant e il lavoro che aveva fatto Ted Grant in Gran Bretagna.
But the fact is that the reformist bureaucracies were in touch with each other at an international level, so everyone in the bureaucracy knew what Ted Grant had built in Great Britain in the previous years.
E volevano eliminarci subito perché ci temevano.
And they wanted to get rid of us since from the start because they feared us.
Nonostante ciò, nonostante l'espulsione, continuavamo ad orientarci al Partito Comunista.
Despite all those expulsions, we pursued an orientation towards the Communist Party.
Ovviamente perché il Partito Comunista era il partito prevalente della classe lavoratrice.
Which at that time was a main force in the working class in Italy.
Però decidiamo anche di dedicare le nostre forze, tutte le nostre forze, al lavoro aperto, in particolare verso gli studenti.
But we also orientated all of our forces towards an open, independent work, in particular amongst the school students.
Pensavano di averci eliminato e invece, grazie a questo lavoro aperto, nell'85 al primo movimento di massa degli studenti, la nostra organizzazione incominciò a crescere rapidamente.
The bureaucracies thought they got rid of us, but with this open youth work, at the first mass movement of the students in 1985, our organization began to grow quite fast.
Una decina di anni dopo iniziamo il lavoro nel Partito della Rifondazione Comunista.
About a decade later, we started work inside the PRC, the Communist Refoundation Party.
In primo luogo un lavoro controcorrente che ci ha impegnato per 20 anni.
Which was also against the stream, and we were engaged in it for about 20 years.
Il momento più importante è stato sicuramente l'inizio di quel lavoro, quando Bertinotti e l'appoggio degli stalinisti conferivano alla direzione una grande autorità.
And the most critical point of that work was certainly the first stage, when the leadership under Bertinotti and the Stalinists still had a big authority.
Ma aver mantenuto sempre un approccio amichevole e i principi fermi davanti alle provocazioni degli stalinisti ci ha permesso di conquistare con tempo e pazienza un'autorevolezza.
But with a flexible approach and a firmness on principle, and with time we were able to gain an authority in that milieu.
E iniziare a reclutare i primi giovani e i primi lavoratori.
And we started to recruit both young people and workers.
Man mano che la direzione del PRC mostrava il proprio opportunismo,
and with time the PRC leadership showed more and more its opportunism,
aumentava la nostra visibilità e la possibilità di costruire una base stabile.
And we began to turn into a point of reference, and we built quite a stable basis for the organization.
Senza mai rinunciare però al lavoro aperto tra gli studenti e i lavoratori.
But we never renounced our open work amongst the students and the workers.
Espulsi dal Partito Comunista, lavoro aperto e orientamento al Partito Comunista.
Expelled from the Communist Party, open work and orientation towards that party.
Lavoro dentro la rifondazione, ma lavoro aperto tra i giovani e i lavoratori.
Inside the PRC, but still conducting open work amongst the youth and the workers.
Lavoro in rifondazione che ci permise anche di diventare un'organizzazione che copriva tutto il territorio nazionale.
Through that work inside the PRC, we were also able to expand the organization on the national scale.
Sono stati due interventi diversi, ma nello stesso tempo possibili grazie al confronto serrato con l'internazionale.
And these different stages and different kind of work we conducted were only possible through a permanent discussion with the international.
L'esperienza dell'internazionale, l'elaborazione teorica dell'internazionale sono un patrimonio inestimabile.
The experience and the theoretical elaboration of this international are a priceless treasure.
Quando il nostro lavoro sindacale era solo agli inizi, contavamo pochissimi lavoratori e tanti studenti.
When we were in the early stages of our trade union work, we had quite a lot of students and very few workers in the organization.
Parliamo dell'inizio degli anni 90.
We are talking of the early 90s.
Una situazione difficile, il crollo dell'Unione Sovietica, la prima guerra in Iraq e il pacifismo, il fallimento del pacifismo che ha demoralizzato il movimento studentesco.
There were not easy times. There were with the fall of the Soviet Union, the failure of the anti-war movement facing the first Iraq war.
E nel 1992 la burocrazia sindacale firma un accordo molto pesante per i lavoratori.
And in 1992, the trade union bureaucracy signed a turning point, a very bad agreement for all the working class in Italy.
Si apre una stagione di contestazione ai dirigenti sindacali dei sindacati tradizionali.
And the new season opens with open protest and questioning by the rank and file against the leaders of the traditional trade unions.
Tantissimi operai vanno in piazza quando il sindacato convoca le mobilitazioni per contestare i dirigenti.
When the trade union leaders call some demonstration, thousands of workers turn out in order to protest and to heckle these leaders.
La rabbia era tanta che molti lavoratori lanciano bulloni nelle manifestazioni, tanto è vero che è stata nominata stagione dei bulloni.
In massive demonstration, there are a group of workers who are so enraged that throw steel bolts against the trade union leaders. So it was later named the autumn of the steel bolts.
Ovviamente le sette, i piccoli gruppi e i sindacati, i piccoli sindacati, spesso anarco-sindacalisti, annunciano la fine dei sindacati tradizionali.
And of course, all the sects, all the
10
ultra-left,
minuti.
all those small split-off trade unions proclaim the death of the trade unions, like they always do.
Anche se il nostro lavoro era solo all'inizio, dedichiamo molto tempo a discutere della posizione dei marxisti nei sindacati.
And despite being just in the early stage, we dedicated a lot of time discussing the Marxist position in relation to trade union work.
La storia dell'organizzazione di massa, il movimento operaio italiano internazionale, le tesi dell'Internazionale comunista ai primi 4 congressi.
The history of the working class movement in Italy and internationally, history of the trade unions, the resolutions and theses of the first 4 congresses of the Communist International regarding trade union work.
Pubblichiamo regolarmente interviste ai lavoratori, organizziamo diffusione di giornali davanti alle fabbriche, iniziamo ad avere i primi delegati sindacali.
We regularly go to factory gates for paper sales, regularly publish interviews with workers, and we began to have the first group of shop stewards inside the organization.
Era difficile spiegare la nostra posizione, cioè la battaglia nella CGL, a un settore di attivisti frustrati.
At that time, it was not easy to explain our position to conduct a battle inside the main trade union to a section of trade union activists who were very frustrated with the bureaucracy.
Poi Berlusconi vince le elezioni, i sindacati vengono messi alla porta e sono costretti a convocare manifestazioni di massa, i sindacati tradizionali che dovevano sparire.
But then, when Berlusconi won his first elections in 1994, those same trade unions are kicked out from any negotiating table and are forced to call mass demonstration. Those same unions who were said they were dying.
Per noi fu un passaggio fondamentale aver accumulato le forze prima e aver così potuto iniziare in modo migliore il nostro lavoro sindacale.
And to us, it was a fundamental question to have already accumulated some forces in order to begin that trade union work on a serious ground.
Ma c'è sicuramente un esempio che forse calza più di tutti.
We can give an example which maybe is the most relevant.
Il movimento No Global del 2001, un movimento poderoso a livello internazionale.
The so-called anti-globalization or anti-capitalist movement in 2001, which was a powerful movement on a world scale.
Che ha visto in Italia un processo di radicalizzazione importante tra i giovani.
Which in Italy saw an important radicalization of the youth.
Un movimento ovviamente dominato da ogni tipo di idea piccolo borghese, perché c'era una direzione piccolo borghese.
The movement was led and dominated by all sorts of petty bourgeois trends and ideas.
Una direzione opportunista, irresponsabile, anarco-sindacalista, piccolo borghese, tutti insomma, potete immaginare il peggio del peggio.
All the possible mistakes of petty bourgeois, anarcho-syndicalist, irresponsible, adventurist ideas were present.
Gli stalinisti stavano alla finestra a guardare che il movimento morisse.
The Stalinists remained on the sidelines waiting for the movement to fail and to ebb.
Le sette davano lezioni su cosa bisognava fare.
The sects were giving letters on how to what to do.
I mandelisti ovviamente erano adattati alla direzione burocratica del movimento.
The Mandelites, of course, were adapted to this bureaucratic and petty bourgeois leadership.
Era un intervento complicato dove potevamo anche rischiare di perdere qualche compagno.
It was not easy to organize a work inside, and we also had the danger of losing comrades.
Ma l'approfondimento teorico, il collegare la lotta alla classe lavoratrice e una strategia audace ci permise di conquistare una parte di questi giovani.
But with a theoretical deepening of our ideas and trying to link this work to the working class, we were able to win a section of this youth.
Io ho finito il tempo, ma volevo dire un'ultima cosa.
My time is almost over, but I want to add just one point.
Senza l'internazionale non saremmo riusciti a lavorare nei momenti più difficili.
Without the international, it would have been impossible to work in the most difficult times.
A sfruttare le occasioni quando si presentavano.
And to take advantage of those opportunities we had.
E questo fa della TMI una vera internazionale, non una somma di organizzazioni o una federazione.
And that is what makes the IMT a real international and not just an addition of different organizations or a federation.
un'unica organizzazione internazionale, in una parola, metodo e le idee di Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky e quindi Ted Grant.
In one, a single organization that is, in one word, the ideas of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, and Ted Grant. Thank you.
Grazie.
Grazie, Paolo. Next speaker is Rob Sewell. Rob Sewell, wait a minute.
Okay, am I coming through loud and clear?
Yes.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank Fred for his very in-depth, very good contribution. And thank him for volunteering me to speak on Militant for 15 minutes. Shows that someone's got a good sense of humor. I know where to start from. Well, you could start by saying that we were the smallest group on the left by far. And then in the space of about 10, 15 years, we became the most successful Trotskyist organization since the creation of the left opposition. Unfortunately, that was thrown away by the majority leadership, who the success went to their head, shall we say. But if you were a betting man, if you're a betting person, you surely wouldn't have. Carry on. You surely wouldn't have bet on Militant to become the biggest force. That's for sure in 1964. But what it showed really was the fact that we had correct ideas and the correct perspective. We were at the right place at the right time with the right ideas. Of course, in the Labour Party at this time, 1964, 65, 66, it wasn't a very good time, really. A Labour government was in power and it was carrying out counter reforms. There were two other groups in the Labour Party at that time, the Healyites, the Socialist Labour League. And the Cliff Group, the International Socialists. And the Young Socialists, the youth section of the Labour Party, was wrecked by the Socialist Labour League. They left the party, and so did the Cliff Group as well. They left as well, the Labour Party. And by 1969, it was a very bad atmosphere. Even some miners' branches were threatening to disaffiliate from the Labour Party because of the policies of the government. And our enemies used to joke about us being the Labour Party. Used to make the sexist comment. Who was in the Labour Party? Old women of both sexes and young men selling militant. But it wasn't far from the truth, really. Was it?
5 minutes gone.
But what we did do was to concentrate on the youth. That was the key question for the building of the tendency. And we did patient work in the Labour Party Young Socialists, rebuilding it from scratch. Work was, I mean, the number of branches we had at that time was one in London, one in Merseyside, and one in Swansea. And there was work, pioneering work done then in Sussex University by Alan. But it was using the banner of the Labour Party Young Socialists that we really made headway in the 1970s. But there'd been a big change in the objective situation. There's a radicalization, not only in Britain, but in Europe as well, you know, in Spain, in Portugal, in Greece and so on. And the left were building in the Labour Party again under Tony Benn. They were rising. A militant rose with the general left in the Labour Party and the trade unions in Britain. By the mid-1970s, we were holding young socialist conferences of 1,000 or more people. By 1976, we'd got up to 1,000 comrades. By 1980, we had 2,000 comrades. So this is how we built, mainly from the youth. But we also built up in the Labour Party. We had quite big delegations at Labour Party conference. And we began to build in the trade unions as well. The witch hunt against militant began in 1976. That's when it began. But it didn't dissuade us. On the contrary, we turned it against them. And by the early 1980s, we were very well established in the Labour Party, developing in the unions. And as a result, the bourgeoisie in Britain were terrified. They were worried that we were putting backbone in the left. And they waged a huge witch hunt to get us out of the Labour Party, to get us expelled. It was a big camp. big campaign in the newspapers every day, on the television, in the radio, attacking militant, get them out. They were infiltrators. And we took advantage of this by holding meetings all around the country, and they were drawing 1,000 people, 1,500 people were attending meetings in big cities all around the country to hear what militants stood for. In Liverpool, we established a very strong base because of years of work in the Labour Party. And we won a number of councillors in Liverpool, and in effect began to decide the policy through the broad left of the Labour Party in Liverpool.
10 minutes.
In fact, we led Liverpool City Council in confrontation with the Tory government. At the same time, we won parliamentary positions. Terry Fields in Liverpool Ball Green and Dave Nellis in Coventry South East. Pat Wall was to win his seat. Going to win his seat in 1987. So we'd have 3 MPs in Parliament by then. It was a time also of the miners' strike in 1984, 1985, where we intervened all over the coal fields. We won 500 miners to the organization. And then in 1988, 1989, we waged this big battle over the poll tax, in which we mobilized something in the order of between 14 and 18 million people. By 1988, we had 8,000 comrades. We became a household name. Everybody knew us. You know, it was on the television and in the newspapers everywhere. Everybody knew Militant. But the whole basis of the organization was Ted's leadership and his theoretical guidance of the organization. But they were those in the leadership, particularly around Peter Taft, who had big ideas, you know, grand ideas. Of course, it was getting difficult in the Labour Party. We had the witch hunt against us, and Neil Kinnock attacking us at the Labour Party conference and all that, and expulsions were taking place. But the majority leadership in the middle started to draw ultra-left ideas. They lost a sense of proportion. That was the main thing. and this was accompanied really by a watering down of the political and theoretical level of the membership, to be honest about
it. 15 minutes.
Theory was just a little extra now, you know. It wasn't central to the organization as it had been. Now it was activism. Activism and activism became the dominant theme. And in 1991, we had the Walton by-election in Liverpool. And the majority leadership wanted to stand a candidate against the Labour Party, and we argued against that. And as a result, the real Labour candidate got 2,600 votes. And it was big boasting. This is a victory for socialism, 2,600 votes for socialism. And some people were bragging, oh, we'll do well. The Labour Party itself will wither on the vine, they said. And we said at the time that you go down this road, there's ultra-left road, and it'll be a detour over a cliff. And in the so-called debate that was took place, the most bureaucratic and degenerate methods were used against the opposition to crush us. They couldn't answer our ideas. They just wanted to crush us and expel us, which they did in the end. And it just reflected a degeneration that had taken place in the leadership of the organization. And the MPs were sacrificed because of Walton, of course. When we were expelled and they went on an independent party, they said, oh, they were bragging, they would get, you know, tens of thousands would join them and so on. And it turned out to be a complete damp squib. And the possibilities there, they just threw it away completely in an ultra-left fashion. So they destroyed Militant. We had to start again from scratch, but based on the real genuine traditions of the tendency, and the success is in front of us today. So my time is now, I think, coming to an end. So I've tried my best, and it's an impossible task. But as they say, read the book and watch the film. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Before Fred sum up, camarade Alan Woods.
I see. You know, I joined this organization in 1960.
Yo entré en esta organización en 1960.
I was still at school. I was 16 years of age.
Todavía estaba en la escuela, tenía solo 16 años.
I'm now a little bit older than that.
Ahora ya soy un poquillo más viejo.
But I can tell you something.
Pero os puedo decir algo.
I have never for one moment regretted that decision.
Nunca en un solo momento me he lamentado de esa decisión.
And I have never left this organization. Many people have, but I have never left the same organization that I joined in 1960.
Y nunca me he marchado de esta organización. Mucha gente lo ha hecho, pero yo no. Yo sigo aquí desde 1960.
And I can assure you, as one who knows,
y os puedo asegurar, como alguien que lo sabe,
that the International Marxist Tendency today
que la corriente marxista internacional hoy en día
is the only true inheritor of the genuine principles of the organization, the tendency established by Comrade Ted Grant so long ago.
Es la única heredera en el mundo de la organización que fue establecida por el compañero Ted Grant.
You know, one thing puzzles me about the sects. When you read the newspapers, you listen to them speaking and so on.
Una cosa que me deja perplejo cuando escuchas a las sectas y lees su prensa.
All of them seem to imagine that history starts with them.
Todos se imaginan que la historia empieza con ellos.
Well, I'll tell you something, communist history. We know history does not start with us.
Pues os digo algo, compañeros, sabéis, la historia no empieza con nosotros.
We're not impressed with the mad chase after so-called new ideas, which are not new at all if you look at if you analyze them.
Nosotros no estamos detrás de esas nuevas ideas que de hecho cuando las analizas no tienen nada de nuevas.
Oh no, we stand for the old ideas.
Nosotros defendemos las viejas ideas.
The old ideas of the Communist Manifesto of the Bolshevik Party of Lenin and Trotsky. That's quite good enough for us.
Sí, las ideas del Manifiesto Comunista, las ideas de Lenin y Trotsky, eso es suficientemente bueno para nosotros.
And those ideas still retain all their vigor and their relevance.
Porque todas esas ideas mantienen su vigor y
Now, there were three things which attracted me to this organization, I remember.
Hay tres cosas que me atrajeron a esta organización.
Oh, as Rob correctly said, we were the smallest of all the left groups, minuscule. I think there were not more than 30 members in the entire, in the whole of Britain, that's to say, in the whole of the world. We had no money, no center, no headquarters, no full-timers. Ted Grant was working as a telephone operator in the post office.
Slow down, please. Slow down.
Okay, sorry. And yet there were three things that attracted me towards this organization. Firstly, a serious attitude towards theory. Secondly, a clear orientation towards the organizations of the working class, the Labour Party and the trade unions. And there was something else. I could see that it was a very clean and democratic and honest organization. That was a fact. Now, it was on the basis of these things that we were able to build up into a serious force in Britain, as Rob pointed out. But at a certain point, why aren't you translating? Well, the thing is that I can't hear the translation. I can't judge the time, you know.
Okay.
So ask him to change. And it was on this basis that we were able to build up. And yet every single one of those principles was destroyed by the criminal activities of a faction, of an ultra-left faction led by Peter Taff and his clique. This is what destroyed the militant, destroyed the most successful Trotskyist organization in the history of Britain, perhaps one of the most successful organizations in the world. And I'll tell you this, comrades, that was a crime which we can never forgive, never ever forgive. Now, I don't intend to deal with any detail Rob mentioned.
5 minutes gone.
the bureaucratic and anti-democratic methods used against the minority in the split. I won't deal with the details. I'll just say this. I have seen all kinds of vicious, brutal, internal Stalinist regimes. I've seen all kinds of monstrous behavior. But I've never in my life, either before or since, seen such vicious and criminal Stalinist gangsterism as what was used by the Tavites in that split. I say that and I repeat it and I will continue to repeat it. And whoever doesn't like it, well, that's their problem. The consequences of this betrayal, because that's what it was, colossal betrayal, were quite clear. It was the destruction of the militant, as I say, and we had to start then from virtually from nothing. The TAF gang took everything. They had the headquarters, big headquarters, they had to sell it subsequently because of the lack of funds, of course. A fool and his money are soon parted, as we say in the British proverb. But they had a big center, they had the printing press, they had the newspaper, of course, they had the full-timers, they had the money, they had everything. What did we have? Well,
Alan, please.
Well, listen, the problem is this. I must have Anna to translate because I can't hear the translation.
Yes, I know.
Please transfer to Anna, please. This is ridiculous.
C'est bon, Anna, you are in. You are in, okay.
Can you hear now? Okay. Well, let's continue. Let's continue. If I can hear the translation, then I know when to stop. We were left with what? I'll tell you what we were left with. We had one small typewriter, and even that didn't work very well. That was the sum total of the apparatus of the IMT. We sat down and discussed, Ted and myself, we sat down and discussed what is our priorities at this moment in time. It was a very difficult moment, by the way. It was a sharp turn to the right in Britain and internationally. Above all, there was the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had a very depressing, demoralizing effect on large elements of the left. And we had the most massive ideological counteroffensive against Marxism launched by the bourgeoisie. Now, comments, what is the role of a Marxist in an historical conjuncture like that? Surely it is to defend the fundamental principles of Marxism against this ideological onslaught of the bourgeoisie. That's what we concluded. And therefore we set about producing the first book it was going to be a series of books. To defend the fundamental principles of Marxism, starting with philosophy, of course. That was always the solid basis of Marxism. It's still the basis today. What was the reaction of Mr. Taff and his pals when they discovered the publication of Reason and Revolt? Oh, they had a good laugh. They really laughed their heads off. They thought it was hilarious. They were joking. They said, look, Ted and Alan have abandoned politics in order to write about philosophy. Now that statement in and of itself is quite sufficient to define these gentlemen, these ladies and gentlemen, I should say. Mustn't forget the ladies. To define them as a profoundly anti-Marxist tendency.
que define una profunda tendencia antimarxista.
Which has dropped all pretense of defending the basic ideas of Marxism.
Que
10 minutes ago.
Cualquier apariencia de defender el marxismo.
In favor of what?
¿En favor de qué?
In favor of a mindless so-called activism, mindless agitation.
A favor de una agitación sin control, o sea, sin definir.
With what result? I think you know the result. For those of you that take an interest in these people, which I do not.
Nosotros vemos ahí el resultado para la gente que se dedique a mirar lo que pasa con esta gente.
I do not consider them even a footnote to history.
Ni siquiera les considero como una nota a pie de página en la historia.
But one thing is clear, they paid the price for their betrayals.
Pero una cosa está clara, han pagado bien caro la traición.
They really were a weird combination of extreme opportunism on the one hand and extreme adventurism on the other hand. I've never seen a tendency like that.
Es una combinación de oportunismo
and adventurism. Yes,
aventurismo.
They were, if you like, the nearest comparison. They were like the economist trend, the revisionist economist trend, which Lenin slammed. Lenin sharply criticized in What Is to Be Done and other writings.
Si queréis, se les puede comparar con la tendencia economista que tanto Lenin criticó tan duramente.
Well, they had a good laugh then, but they're not laughing now, I can tell you.
Bueno, se rieron de nosotros en aquel entonces, pero os puedo decir que ahora no están riéndose.
They're finished. I won't say anything more on that subject.
Están acabados y bueno, ya no voy a seguir hablando de ellos.
Now, just compare that Philistine attitude, Philistine anti-Marxist attitude towards theory.
Esa actitud filistina antimarxista hacia la teoría.
Just compare that to Lenin writing Materialism and Empiriocriticism in 1908.
Y compararla con Lenin cuando en 1908 escribió Materialismo y Empiriocriticismo.
When the forces of counter-revolution were raging in Tsarist Russia.
Cuando las fuerzas reaccionarias estaban cabalgando en la Rusia zarista.
Oh, and what was Lenin doing reading Hegel, writing about Hegel in Zurich during the First World War? Could he not find anything better to do with this time?
Y que estaba haciendo también Lenin leyendo la lógica de Hegel durante la Primera Guerra Mundial en Zurich.
I think Lenin knew what he was doing.
Creo que Lenin sabía lo que estaba haciendo.
He knew that by studying theory, he was preparing the ground for such masterpieces as State and Revolution and preparing the practical grounds for the Russian Revolution. Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Leyendo eso, él era consciente de que estaba preparando el terreno para las bases teóricas para la revolución socialista.
Now, you might imagine that with Ted and I must have been very upset by the split.
Quizás os podéis imaginar que nosotros, Ted y yo, estábamos un poco defraudados con toda esta situación.
You'd be profoundly mistaken.
Pero estaríais totalmente preocupados.
Ted, Anna, Rob Sewell, and myself were not a bit bothered about this split, not at all, not in the slightest degree.
Ted, Alan, Rob Sewell y Ana no tenían ninguna preocupación de esta situación.
It was absolutely clear to us by this time that we had to separate from this degenerate trend. Had to separate. It was a matter of life and death.
Para nosotros quedó claro en aquel momento que teníamos que separarnos de esa gente porque era una cuestión de vida o muerte.
They did us a favor by expelling us. That's all.
Pero bueno,
that's okay.
Nos hicieron un favor expulsándonos.
And Reason and Revolt, you know, it had a colossal effect. It was one of the fundamental ways in which we began to build the organization.
Actually, la revolución tuvo un gran efecto porque de hecho fue un poco como la plataforma de lanzamiento de la organización.
We had the most enthusiastic comments.
Tuvimos los comentarios más entusiastas.
Not just from students, but from workers. Oh yes, many workers and many trade unionists.
No solo de estudiantes, sino de trabajadores.
You see,
muchos obreros.
There's one thing. I'm from a poor working class family in South Wales myself.
Yo vengo de una familia obrera pobre del sur de Gales.
My grandfather was a communist. There were always books in our house, always.
Mi abuelo era un comunista y siempre teníamos libros en la casa.
I still got them now. Anti-Düring, The Origin of the Species, and so on.
Y de hecho todavía tengo algunos de esos libros en la casa, como el Anti-Düring.
And if there's something I cannot stand, something that really makes me mad.
Y algo que no soporto.
It's the prejudice of petty bourgeois elements.
Es los prejuicios de los elementos.
Some petty bourgeois students, not our students, of course, but some.
Estudiantes, pequeños porque eso es el supuesto, no los nuestros.
Some who dare to call themselves Marxists, I don't know why,
Y algunos de ellos se atreven a llamarse marxistas,
who have a contempt for the working class,
tienen un desprecio hacia la clase
and they think the
obrera,
workers are not interested in theory.
y piensan que los trabajadores
Yes.
no tienen interés en la teoría.
Yeah,
Sí,
that's what Taft thought, and all the miserable gang that was with. That's what they all thought that.
eso es lo que pensaba Taft y toda la gente que se fue con él.
Don't bother the workers with theory.
No les molestes a los obreros con teoría.
Reason and revolt proved what we knew all the time.
Razón y revolución demostró todo lo que sabíamos todo este tiempo.
And at least the advanced workers, the thinking workers, the people that we're aiming for,
Que a lo mejor, desde luego los obreros más avanzados, la gente a la que nosotros nos dirigíamos,
have a thirst for theory.
sí que tenían una sed de teoría.
As a matter of fact, they have a more serious attitude towards theory than many so-called intellectuals, if the truth were to be told.
Tienen una
15 minutes.
seria a la teoría que muchos de estos llamados intelectuales.
But Reason and Revolt also was very successful with students, with intellectuals, also with university professors.
Pero incluso Razón y Revolución también tuvo mucho efecto entre universitarios y profesores.
It had a big effect. For example, I remember we received an email from the University of Rio de Janeiro.
Por ejemplo, me acuerdo en aquel entonces que recibimos una carta de un departamento de una universidad de Río de Janeiro.
We didn't have any comrade in Mexico, in Brazil at that time, of
En
course.
aquel entonces no teníamos ningún compañero en Brasil.
Asking, could they use the section on human origins in Reason and Revolt as the basis for a postgraduate course in the University of, in the biological department of the university?
Y nos escribieron pidiendo permiso para reproducir la parte del Razón y Revolución sobre los orígenes humanos para un curso postgraduado.
Later, we received a similar request from the Department of Physics in the UNAM, the University of Mexico, National University.
Más tarde nos llegó otra petición del Departamento de Física de la Universidad UNAM de México.
Oh, yes. And it was through Reason and Revolt, you may not know this, it was through Reason and Revolt
Y sí, fue a través de Razón y Revolución, quizás no sepáis esto,
that I established personal contact with the late Hugo Chavez,
que establecí unas relaciones personales, un contacto personal con Hugo Chávez,
who was deeply impressed with the book.
que estaba profundamente impresionado por el libro.
Actually, his brother was telling me, Adam Chavez,
De hecho,
was another friend of mine, Adam Chavez, was
su hermano,
telling me,
Adam Chávez, que es un amigo,
he was a physicist, also an ex-guerrilla, but he was a
que también
physicist.
es un físico de profesión, de estudios,
And he walked into Chavez's,
guerrillero,
he walked into Chavez's bedroom, and he saw this book, Reason and Revolt, on the side of the bed.
y en algún momento entró en el dormitorio del hermano de Hugo Chávez y vio mi libro en la mesilla de noche del presidente.
He said, "What's this? A book about science? Well, I'll take this. It's no good to you."
Y le dice, ¿qué haces con un libro sobre ciencias? Eso no te sirve a ti, déjalo.
And Chavez told him, "You bugger off, clear off. It's my book.
Y
Go and get your
Chávez
own
le
copy."
dijo, vete a freír espárragos y cómprate tu propio libro.
But it was from there that Chavez and I developed a relationship. And by the way,
Y fue a partir de ahí que desarrollamos una relación.
Hugo Chavez, you can say a lot about it. You can make criticisms, all that you like.
Y por cierto, puedes decir todo lo que quieras y hacer todas las críticas que quieras de Hugo Chávez.
But I used to know the man, and I'm firmly convinced
Pero yo conocí bastante cerca al hombre y yo te puedo decir una cosa.
that Hugo Chavez, despite all his faults, was a sincere and honest revolutionary
Que a pesar de todos sus defectos, era un hombre sincero
who wanted to carry out the socialist revolution in Venezuela. He wanted to
que
carry it out.
quería llevar a cabo la revolución socialista en Venezuela.
And he looked upon our tendency, myself also, but the tendency, the IMT, he knew all about the IMT.
Y miraba hacia nosotros, hacia mí también personalmente, pero sobre todo hacia la organización, la CMI.
With enormous respect. We had enormous authority with Hugo Chavez. I know that for a fact.
Respeto, con una gran autoridad, lo sé, a ciencia cierta.
Now I can't develop that point. Of Venezuela is a separate discussion.
No puedo desarrollar más ese punto porque Venezuela en sí sería un punto a desarrollar.
But what it does show is the importance of ideas.
Pero esto lo que muestra es la importancia de las ideas.
And we have to make it clear to everybody. There's no possible confusion about this when they ask, what is the IMT?
Y esto no podemos permitir que haya ninguna confusión. ¿Qué es la CMI?
I answer.
Contesto.
The IMT is a hard line.
La CMI es una organización de línea dura,
Orthodox, Marxist, Leninist, Trotskyist organization.
ortodoxa, marxista, leninista y trotskista.
As a matter of fact, we're the only tendency in the world
De hecho, somos la única tendencia en el mundo
that has consistently fought and continues to fight
que siempre, de una manera consistente, ha luchado y sigue luchando
for the genuine traditions and ideas of Bolshevism, Leninism,
por las genuinas ideas y tradiciones del bolchevismo y
both in
marxismo,
its ideology and theory,
tanto a nivel ideológico
What do you mean?
and also in its organizational methods and tactics.
y también en cuanto a los métodos y tácticas organizativas.
And therefore, it is necessary, but of course, we must understand
Pero tenemos que entender
the Revolutionary Party does not exist in a vacuum.
que el Partido Revolucionario no existe en el vacío.
We live in this rotten capitalist society,
Vivimos en esta sociedad capitalista podrida
and we are under the constant pressure of alien class ideas.
y estamos bajo la constante presión de ideas alienantes,
And we must be aware of that fact.
ajenas, y tenemos que ser conscientes de ese hecho.
And therefore, it is necessary to wage a constant and relentless struggle
Y por lo tanto tenemos que llevar una lucha sin cuartel
against the pernicious influence of bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideas,
contra la perniciosa influencia de las ideas burguesas y pequeñas
which inevitably end up to expressing themselves either as opportunism or ultra-left
que
sectarianism.
inevitablemente terminan expresando como oportunismo o ultraizquierdismo sectario.
Do we have internal crises and battles and splits? Oh, yes.
Tenemos,
Oh,
crisis
yes.
internas, batallas, escisiones, sí,
Oh,
por
yes.
supuesto, sí, sí.
And I have no doubt that when our enemies look at the history of the IMT,
Y no tengo ni la menor duda de que cuando nuestros enemigos miran la historia de la CMI,
they will doubtless choose to present it as a history of constant internal battles,
elegirán
crises, splits, and so on.
elegirán elegir que es decir que es una que somos una batalla, un centro de batalla y de constantes problemas.
No doubt they find this spectacle rather amusing.
Que lo encuentran como un espectáculo gracioso.
On the other hand, there are some comrades that I know
Pero por otro lado hay otros compañeros que conozco
that have found this a bit depressing at
que
times.
a veces esto lo encuentran un poco deprimente.
You know, they're both wrong.
Pero
They're both wrong.
ambos están equivocados.
Trotsky liked to quote the famous phrase by Spinoza, the great philosopher.
A Trotsky le gustaba repetir la frase famosa de Spinoza.
Neither weep nor laugh, but understand.
Ni
Understand.
reír, ni llorar, sino comprender.
You see, oh, by the way, there's one thing, let's nail this once and for all. Let's nail this nonsense once and for all.
Dejemos claro una cosa para siempre.
You always get this after every crisis, every split.
Porque siempre pasa esto después de cada
Some
crisis.
some comments are looking busily for some recipe, some magic solution to avoid crises and splits.
Los compañeros están buscando como fórmulas mágicas, recetas para combatir la crisis.
Let's have a look at the statutes, see if we can change the rules to
Vamos a mirar los
legislate against splits and crises.
Vamos a mirar los estatutos, a ver si legislamos de diferente manera y así se evitan las excisiones.
You know, Moses tried that trick a long time ago with his 10 commandments.
¿Sabéis? Moisés intentó ese truco hace muchos siglos con los 10 mandamientos.
Which were intended to prohibit sin by law, by decree, by statutes.
Cuya intención era prohibir el pecado a través de estatutos, a través de legislación.
I'm afraid that after several thousand years, his experiment didn't have a very happy ending.
Me temo que después de varios miles de años su experimento no ha tenido éxito.
And in attempts to find a cookbook that will find the magic solution are also condemned to the same result.
Intentar elaborar una especie de libro de recetas, pues tampoco va a tener mejor resultado.
My dear friends, let me tell you.
Amigos míos, dejadme que os diga.
There is no such cookbook in existence.
No existe semejante.
You won't find it. You're wasting your time.
Para evitar las excisiones, no lo encontraréis.
If it did exist, by the
Si
way,
existiese, por cierto,
Marx and Engels didn't know it because they had plenty of crises and splits with the Bakuninists and so on.
Marx y Engels no lo conocían porque tuvieron bastantes problemas y excisiones y con los bakuninistas.
Trotsky didn't know it. He had the same problem.
Tampoco lo conocía, tenía el mismo problema.
And Lenin, well, the amount of splits the Bolshevik party had was nobody's business.
Y
You know?
Lenin, bueno, pues la cantidad de
So,
excisiones
please
que
don't-
tuvo el partido bolchevique, pues
Please don't waste your time, my friends.
amigos, no desperdiciéis vuestro tiempo.
I think Rob said it correctly.
Creo que Rob lo dijo
insofar as there's some kind of, or might have been Fred, insofar as there's some kind of guarantee against degeneration.
25 minutes.
It is only the development, raising the political and theoretical level of the cadres. Above all, the stability of the party depends on the moral and political authority of the leadership.
Por encima de todo, la estabilidad del partido depende de la autoridad moral y política de la dirección.
If you have a morally and intellectually equipped leadership with authority in the eyes of the membership,
si tenemos esa dirección moralmente equipada teóricamente, entonces eso sí que es algo.
Those leaders will never have to resort to expulsions and splits and organizational maneuvers. Why should they? They can answer the questions, answer the differences.
Nunca tendrán que recurrir a expulsiones o medidas organizativas porque sabrán responder a todas las cuestiones, a todas las preguntas, a todos los problemas.
And by the way, crises and splits are an inherent part of not just of politics, but of life itself.
Y por cierto, las crisis y las escisiones, estas son inherentes no solo a la vida política, sino también a la vida misma.
They are inevitable.
Son inevitables.
Birth is a crisis.
El nacimiento es una crisis.
A very painful crisis.
Una crisis.
Adolescence is a crisis.
La adolescencia.
You got the crisis of middle age.
Luego está la crisis de la edad medio
and so on.
de la vida.
People pass through these crises.
La gente pasa a través de todas estas crisis.
Weak individuals collapse. They're dragged under by the crisis.
Los individuos débiles colapsan y son arrastrados por esa crisis.
But a strong man or woman overcomes the crisis and emerges strengthened.
Pero un hombre y una mujer que se enfrenten a ello y puedan vencerlo, se fortalecerán.
And I can state without fear of contradiction, everybody knows this, everyone can see it.
Puedo declararlo con plena confianza, todo el mundo puede ver esto.
The IMT has emerged colossally strengthened by the experience of the last 10 or 20 years, including the internal battles and so on. Yes, it's strengthened us.
De los últimos 20 años fortalecidos.
Now, I should say, of course, that we are a democratic organization. There's plenty of debates take place, and so that's as it should be.
Puedo decir que somos una organización muy democrática con muchos debates
That's as it should be. But you see, there is another side of the question.
Pero hay otro lado a la cuestión.
The IMT is not a debating society, my friends.
La CMI no es una sociedad de debate.
You know, it's a militant revolutionary organization.
Es una organización militante revolucionaria.
And there's a problem, isn't there, particularly with students and academic people, academics. How I despise academics. Yes, oh yes, especially so-called academic Marxists. How I despise those creatures. Yes, let me tell you something, my friends. Look, you can be an academic, or you can be a Marxist. You can't be both. It's a contradiction in terms. I'm very sorry. It's a contradiction in terms. And these academics, they spend all their lives arguing and debating about this and that trivial question, you know. Of course, they have all the time in the world because they don't do anything else. Just talk and talk and talk endlessly. Yeah. Workers are not like that. And neither are the Marxists. For us, discussion and debate are functional things. You debate for a reasonable space of time. You listen to all points of view. But at the end, my friends, you've got to decide. You must decide. Any worker understands that. Maybe some students or petty bourgeois types don't understand. Workers understand it. Before a strike, there's a democratic debate always.
una situación de convocatoria de huelga, pues hay discusión.
Some workers are in favor of the strike, some others speak against the strike.
Algunos obreros hablarán a favor, otros hablarán en contra.
But at the end of the day, they proceed to a vote.
Pero al final del día,
30 minutes, conclusion please.
And the majority decides and the minority accepts. They do accept, willingly. And that's the same with us.
Y eso es lo mismo con nosotros.
The IMT is a revolutionary army.
La CMI es un partido revolucionario.
And therefore we must have a disciplined army, of course.
Un ejército revolucionario.
The difference with a professional bourgeois army is that their discipline is imposed as something external, something from outside.
La disciplina es impuesta sobre ellos.
In our army, which is a volunteer army of revolutionaries, our discipline comes from inside, from a firm conviction in the justice of the cause which we are fighting for, and the correctness of our methods. You know, I will draw my remarks to a close, but comrades who know me like me to quote from the Bible. You know what the Bible says? Like unto the man who builded his house upon the sand. And the wind came and the rain, and it blew upon that house. And the house fell. We don't want to be like that, do we? We want to be like the man who built his house upon the rock. And the wind came and the rain, and it fell upon that house, and the house fell not. Of course, what Jesus Christ was referring to was the rock of religious faith.
Por supuesto, la roca a la que se refería Jesucristo era la roca de la fe religiosa.
I hasten to reassure you that I'm speaking as a dedicated and firm atheist and materialist.
Estoy hablando como un ateo empedernido.
We have no need for religious faith, comrades, none whatsoever.
No necesitamos recurrir a la fe religiosa.
But we do have faith.
Pero sí tenemos fe.
We must have faith.
Tenemos que tener fe.
Faith in the working class is the only force that can change society.
Fe en la clase obrera como la única fuerza capaz de cambiar, de transformar la sociedad.
Faith in the ideas of Marxism, which are the only ideas which can carry the working class to victory.
Fe en las ideas del marxismo, que son las únicas que pueden llevar a la clase obrera a la victoria.
And why not? Faith in ourselves.
¿Y por qué no? Fe en nosotros mismos.
Because you know, comrades, if we don't do the work, nobody else is going to do it for us.
¿Sabéis por qué, compañero? Porque si nosotros no hacemos el trabajo, nadie lo va a hacer por nosotros.
So I conclude by this marvelous school. This is very inspirational to me.
Concluyo dirigiéndome a esta escuela que está provocando tanta inspiración.
I add the final phrase.
Ahí añado la frase final.
Yes, comrades. Faith in the International Marxist Tendency.
Sí, compañeros, fe en la corriente marxista internacional.
And in its future victory.
Y en su victoria futura.
In the struggle for the world socialist revolution.
En la lucha por la revolución socialista.
Thank you very much, Alan. Now it's Fred to the conclusion.
How much time have I got?
Okay.
Can't hear you, Hubert.
Can you get rid of this text, Owen, please?
Thank you, Jordi.
Okay. Well, I have a lot more to say that you can say in 20 minutes, but I will try and keep it brief. If you look at the points that I referred to in the beginning, but if you go even further back to the first, the second, and the third internationals, you will find that there were objective reasons why certain things happened to those organizations. The Second International, there was a period of upswing which led to the adaptation to capitalist society on the part of that organization. The Third International degenerated on the basis of the isolation of the Russian Revolution. The Fourth International, I explained the impact of the post-war boom. Those are objective factors. But there's also subjective elements involved. I'll touch on that in a minute. But there was always a minority that did not succumb to those pressures. Lenin was in the Second International. Trotsky was in the Second International. The followers of the left opposition in the 30s did not succumb to the degeneration of the Soviet Union. Whereas Mandel, Cannon, and all the others, they did feel the impact of the post-war boom, and they zigzagged from one mistake to another. You see how Ted maintained a balanced position and preserved the ideas. There were objective elements involved in the militant as well. The 1980s, in one country after another, saw some important defeats of the working class. The miners' strike in Britain was a defeat. The defeat of the Fiat workers in Italy in 1980. There was a bourgeois offensive against the working class in the 1980s after the struggles of the 70s. The militant and the old international, the CVI, rose on the back of the big movement of the 70s. But then important events had an impact on the organization. And again, it was the inability of the majority of the leadership to come to terms with the new situation that led to the collapse of that organization.
I
remember there was a refusal to recognize that the situation had changed. The refusal went as far as refusing even to recognize that the organization was becoming weaker. You know, in 1991, I looked in the details of the internal bulletins of the militant. And I was very surprised at what I found. A large number of inactive members, not going to meetings, not paying subs, not selling the paper. But what shocked me even more is when I went to Britain to participate in the conference of the militant. I was in Italy at the time. I was shocked by the level. And this was a consequence of methods which had been adopted at the top of the organization. Looking, and basically it was a seeking for shortcuts. The theoretical level of the organization had gone down as a consequence. Now that is fatal for a revolutionary organization. When the objective situation becomes more difficult, you need to pay particular attention to raising a theoretical understanding of the membership. Otherwise, the most powerful organization can be destroyed. Part of that seeking shortcuts was connected to prestige politics. Comrades, prestige politics is a poison which undermines the revolutionary movement. Prestige politics, particularly of the leadership, can destroy the organization. Because what does it mean? If you've made a mistake, you are not prepared to correct it because it means admitting that you, the leadership, made that mistake. You go down that road and you end up destroying the organization. Because unless you are capable of reappraising the situation when it's necessary and honestly admitting when things have changed and also when you've made mistakes, you will be destroyed. And part of this is, this was particularly, I saw it in the militant in the latter period, was the promotion of certain types. I would call them the sort of the street-going action men and women. And anybody that's genuinely interested in theory is put to one side. When the objective situation becomes difficult, those people are incapable of reorientating. But they were promoted within the militant towards the end. I had personal experience of it. The arrogant type, the bullying type, I would actually say. You know, they think they're the boys. We've made it. We're this big organization. Who can tell us? There's one thing I've learned from that experience. Do not promote to positions of responsibility any comrade that reveals a tendency to personal ambition. Do not put anybody in a position of advising others on how to build who have not shown the ability to build themselves. When we get back to having physical meetings, physically together, we'll have a few drinks, and I can explain some of the experiences I had because of that. Now, Alan said it, the only kind of authority that a leadership of a revolutionary Marxist organization can have is a moral and a political authority. That's the way you behave, the way you lead, and your ability to develop the ideas and provide perspectives. That's why Ted Grant had the authority. I quoted what he wrote in the 40s and earlier, and that's what gave him authority in the long run. I remember when they accused Alan and Ted of being mere theoreticians. Mere theoreticians. Forgetting what Lenin said, without revolutionary theory, there is no revolutionary action. Look at the attention Lenin gave to theory. His writings on imperialism, the national question, the state, philosophy, imperial criticism, classical work of Marxism. We base ourselves on that approach. And we base ourselves on a healthy democratic internal regime. That's the only way of making sure we get the correct ideas, comrades.
15 minutes.
And we also have a flexible approach to the way we work in the labor movement. When you have an unhealthy regime and prestige politics, it usually expresses itself in a crude interpretation of Marxism with no real theoretical understanding. And then you become like a ship without a compass. Now, we need to build a healthy Marxist organization. But we also must be ever vigilant against the tendencies that we've seen develop in the past. Marx suffered this problem. I haven't got time here, but there's a letter that it's to Friedrich Bolt in New York in 1871. And he explains the problems they had in the First International. Now, the IMT, when it decided to launch a new, but at the same time an old organization, we decided that we would base ourselves first and foremost on the defense of Marxist theory. Alan has explained that. And turn to the fresh layers of the youth. It's amazing. There's people in the movement who see the IMT they can't understand how can we have so much youth. They just discuss theory. That's the reason why we're growing. We started with smaller forces back in 91, 92. After you have a split, you always have problems. Why did it happen? What did we do wrong? And we had our problems. But I tell you, we have fully recovered now. Look, in these countries that I'm going to list now, we had nothing. Canada, United States, Venezuela, Brazil, Nigeria, South Africa, Russia, Central America, Eastern Europe. Apart from Pakistan, nothing else in Asia. You'll get a much more thorough report later on. But we have built many, many, many sections since then. Holland, Norway, Switzerland. How can this be possible? It's because we've maintained a firm defense of the basic ideas of Marxism. And it's with ideas that you build an organization. And what's the essence of the IMT? Preserve the genuine ideas of Marxism, a revolutionary position, at the same time a non-sectarian position. We take these ideas to the youth and the working class. and we build a healthy, democratic, revolutionary Marxist international. We must constantly pay attention to education. We mustn't forget the experiences that we've been through. Because mistakes can be repeated. And the reason why we study this kind of experience is also to learn the lessons and not repeat, or at least attempt not to repeat those mistakes. There are many left groups out there. And unfortunately, with their sectarian antics and their opportunist adaptation, they've done it. They've done a disservice to the tradition of Leon Trotsky. The left opposition in the 1930s had a clean banner. So we're not just struggling against the Stalinists and the reformists who dominate the labor movement. We're struggling to re-establish that clean banner of the international left opposition.
22 minutes.
That's what the IMT is. We've given you an outline of what we stand for and where we come from. We've been working hard against the stream for periods. The stream has now changed in our favor. This school is the proof of the correctness of our method and ideas. We also have added to the heritage. The book by Alan and Ted on Marxism and Science, our analysis of the national question of the European Union, China, imperialism, the books that we've produced on Germany, on Russia, on Spain, and others. And we've established Marxist.com, the In Defense of Marxism website, as a point of reference for revolutionary workers and youth around the world who are looking for answers. We have built the strong foundations upon which the building will stand. Now the world is in crisis, an unprecedented crisis. The world is sinking into barbarism. But there is a class that can stop that. The working class. It requires leadership. The crisis of humanity now is the crisis of the leadership of the working class. We must solve that crisis. We must put an end to it by building a powerful Marxist tendency embedded in the labor movement of all countries. That's what the IMT is about. And I would invite all of those listening who haven't done so, who haven't done yet, haven't joined yet, to join. Join us and help us to build the IMT. We have a big job to do after this school. The work continues beyond the 4 days. That's my... It's late. I'm sure you're tired.
Thank you very much, Fred. Thank you, everybody, to have followed the school today. I invite you tomorrow for the last day of the school. At 1 p.m. British Summer Time for 3 sessions running in parallel. Marxism and religion, Marxism versus queer theory, Marxism versus pacifism, and then the closing online rally at 5:30 p.m. on building the Revolutionary Party. Thank you very much.